So my name is Chris Leader. Great to be with you all today. Really fun to be back and speaking at Georgetown, even if it's not in person. So I graduated in the college in 2010. I majored in psychology and minored in government. And as of right now, I'm a staff product manager at a technology company called Twilio. So I think probably to start off, I can chat a little bit about where I was at when I was in your shoes, the student shoes, back at Georgetown. I think I was a pretty quintessential college student who loved liberal arts and wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with my life when I walked through the gates into the real world. And I actually was a transfer student into Georgetown. I spent my freshman year at Penn State studying engineering in an undecided track within engineering, and kind of got the itch to study liberal arts. And once that opened up, I realized I didn't have to be at a school that had a formal engineering program. And Georgetown really resonated with me for a lot of reasons, including the values of the school. And so I transferred into Georgetown my sophomore year, kind of never looked back, and I'm really grateful for the liberal arts education I got at Georgetown. But when senior year rolled around, honestly, like I think I hadn't done a lot of serious thinking about exactly the type of role I was going to look for when I graduated. And this was further complicated by the fact that the economy was in a really rough spot in the spring of 2010, on the heels of the Great Recession. So I think coming out of Georgetown, I felt a lot of pressure because I had really good friends who always seemed to know exactly what they wanted to do with their life. And a lot of those people, now with the benefit of like 10 years hindsight, have gone and made incredible careers doing exactly what they expected to do. I had friends in MSB who went into banking. I have friends who are doctors now. I have a lot of friends who are lawyers. And so I'm really proud of them and really inspired by what they did. And I just remember feeling this pressure because first and foremost, I felt like I wanted to have some sort of social impact on the world. But I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to do that. And in my summers in between the school year, I did various things. I worked for the DC Department of the Environment for a couple of summers on a summer jobs program. So we built a community garden and at a charter school in Anacostia. We cleared out some state parks of invasive species and worked with kids doing that. And then I also spent a summer in South Africa, focused on international development in a rural community. And all of those experiences really resonated with me. And I really enjoyed having the opportunity to give back, but even more so, I felt like I learned so much from working with the communities that I did. And so when I graduated, much to my parents' chagrin, I decided to take an unpaid internship at a nonprofit called Grameen Foundation, which focuses on, at the time it was focusing on bringing microfinance to the underbanked and the unbanked in the global South. And when I took that unpaid internship, I ended up moving back home with my family in Montgomery County, Maryland. And I needed some source of income. So I started working at an Apple store part-time. And mind you, like this is back in 2011 at this point. I still had a flip phone. And this is around the time that the iPhone 4 came out. And what was really, it was an amazing time for me because I was somewhat of a Luddite. I didn't know too much about technology. I had like a MacBook in college. But I didn't think too deeply about it. And when I worked at this Apple store, I think I learned more in a period of 6 months than I've learned at any other time in my life. Not just about the technology and the products that Apple offered, but about customer service. And I had some really formative experiences just seeing how technology could dramatically change somebody's life. I remember we had a grandmother come into the store and she purchased an iPad and was FaceTiming her grandkids across the country. And like, it's just sitting in the Apple store sobbing because she felt this like very human connection with these grandchildren. And I was so moved by that. And I don't want to over romanticize it because I was working retail. my feet hurt at the end of every day, my back hurt. Like I have so much respect for people who work in the retail industry because it is really hard work and it can be really draining, especially if people aren't very respectful with you. Um, but that really planted a seed for me. And when I was at Grameen Foundation, I noticed that the executives who were having the most impact actually had experience in the tech sector. And so we had a satellite branch in Seattle where we had board members and our CTO and some other senior leadership in the organization were coming from Microsoft. And I thought that was really interesting because it became clear to me that they had a lot of really valuable private sector experience. And they were able to bring that into the nonprofit world and have a bigger impact than, not necessarily a bigger impact, but that was their route to having a big impact. And so I found myself at this crossroads where my unpaid internship, I was offered a full-time job at Grameen. I left the Apple store. And I was fortunate to work at Grameen in operations for several years, which I'll happy to talk more about that. At the end of 2012, a friend of mine who had gone to Georgetown, her father actually worked at Google in this top secret arm of Google called Google X, which now is more public, but it's the R&D side of Google that has spun out and is now a separate company under Alphabet. But they were placing investments on big bets, and he was working on self-driving cars. And I caught word that they were working on a new project that they couldn't really talk about. And they were looking for kind of jacks of all trade to come in as a contractor and help out. And it turned out to be Google Glass. And I decided to move across the country from DC to California in 2013 to take an operations specialist role at Google. It's actually on a contract basis, and ended up working on that for 2 years. Did a bunch of interesting things there. And then I got the startup itch. Once I was out in Silicon Valley, I spent time in SF and then also down in LA, and ended up going to a small startup that was about 10 people. And we made an Internet of Things connected light bulb with embedded sensors in it. And so we were kind of making the nest for smart lighting, and this is around 2015. And I went into that organization in an operations capacity as well, and really found myself gravitating toward the product. And this is something I experienced where I was at Google, but Google's a massive company. Google has the ability to hire anybody for a product role that they want to, and especially people with deep engineering expertise, which I did not have at that time. So for me, I was able to go to this smaller startup called Stack Lighting, and our founder and CEO, Neil, actually came from Tesla, where he had run delivery for the Model S. And so he had a lot of amazing experience and put an amazing team together. And I just worked super hard. I loved what we did. It was down in Cupertino, so I commuted from SF down to Cupertino and back. And kind of your classic cliche, like working nights and weekends, like all the time on the startup. And I gravitated more and more towards product. Because it was a small team and I was taking on more responsibility, Neil actually gave me the opportunity to become a product manager and take on more and more of the product. And so I worked at Stack for about 2.5 years. We were at a crossroads there in terms of either going to venture capital and raising a big round or selling the company. And unfortunately, we had a Fortune 50 at the time partner who was signed a letter of intent to buy us and then pulled that offer out at the last minute. We ran out of money, company imploded. And so I found myself in the summer of 2017 still kind of moonlighting, working for Stack. I still had a lot of equity in the company, but needed something more stable. And was also looking to join an organization where there was a more formal product organization where I could learn from other PMs who had kind of more experience than me, who had been PMing for longer. Was looking to retire my PM imposter syndrome, basically. And so in the summer of 2017, I joined a company called SendGrid as a product manager, actually on the technical side, building out our platform. And in 2019, Twilio, the company I'm at now, bought SendGrid. And so I joined Twilio through that acquisition. And in June of this year, I'll be coming up on 4 years of time spent between Twilio and SendGrid. So I know that that's a that was kind of like a sweeping history of my time since graduating from Georgetown. But just kind of wanted to give you the backstory about where I was at when I graduated, some of the motivating factors for what I was looking for in a job, and ultimately what led me to technology, and the different operations and products roles I've had to date. So I can pause there, and then I'm happy to focus in on anything specific.
That was great. I loved hearing your story. I would love to hear, and I'm going to keep recording for this because I think it'd be helpful for students to know like what helped you understand that you'd want to do more product, and then if you could give like a sample of a project that you're working on and what that looks like on a product end, and I guess a few things that you've done in operations as well, just to help students understand.
Yep. I think it kind of all comes back to the experiences that I had in that Apple store. Um, Apple's a very polarizing company. I recognize that like a lot of people despise Apple products because they think that it represents like um, they're expensive. They may not feel like Apple's justified in charging the prices that they charge. It's a little bit more locked down and less open. So I definitely understand all those things, but I can just say from a human perspective of working in that store when I did, seeing the impact that these products had on real people and the fervor that people had for these products, I'd never seen anything like that before. And like Steve Jobs was still in charge in this era. And when I first joined, it was the original iPad had just been launched, and I was there for the launch of the iPad 2. Um, and and when I was like ramping up, just understanding like what the products were, what the selling points were, like I'm trying to understand. Try not to give away Apple IP here, but they had a certain process for understanding a customer's needs and then finding the right solution for the customer based on their needs. And I just remember thinking like, holy crap, like who are the people who actually build these things? I'm in this retail store across the country, and so removed from the actual day-to-day process at headquarters and other areas around the world. Like I would love to understand how, I'm at the very end of this product's journey. I would love to understand the rest of it. And so I think that's when the seed was planted. And that's one of the reasons I jumped at the opportunity to go to Google, because Google Glass was so early in its life cycle at that point. And Google made a really interesting decision to bring Glass to market when they did. I would argue that it was a bad decision. um, Not insofar as Google shouldn't have done it necessarily, but I think you can do R&D, you can do product development in the lab without necessarily bringing it to market and getting the exposure that they did, because it was just too early for that product. But what was cool about being a part of that was um, it was because it was a smaller team within Google working on this. I got more exposure to actual product development, and the skills that I was able to bring to the table at that point was frankly like I was hardworking. I think I was like smart enough to be able to pick up new things, but more importantly, willing to pick up new things. And so in that operations role, really they could point me at a bunch of different things. Like I helped set up a retail store in LA. I helped figure out logistics um, for all of the inventory sending to our first party stores that we were building out. How do you do returns? How do you deal with customers who have issues with the product? I worked on getting that feedback to the product team. And so I was able to actually um, get closer and closer to the product at that point. Um, the people, the product team at that point who was like building it out. Um, but I was not able to actually like work on the product itself at that point. And so I think for me, it was just like, I just had this natural interest in product. To me, it's kind of like the heart of why any company exists, is to provide a product or a service. And I had this curiosity starting with the Apple Store and then my experience at Google, where I kind of just from there, starting with that interest and that curiosity, was like, how do I get closer and closer to this? How are people building these things? And just trying to learn from everybody I could along the way, until ultimately at Stack, I was still doing operations, but finally got my break to start working on product.
And can you share an example of what you've done in product?
Absolutely. So I'll speak about Stack first. I mentioned it's kind of like the product was a Nest for smart lighting. And so Neil, our founder, had this vision for making a light bulb, um, like a really high-end light bulb with embedded internet connectivity, embedded sensors, and the experience that it created was so cool. Um, we had this small office in Cupertino that was adjacent to like an old house, and so we actually converted the house into a staging room where we would show the product and demo it to people. And then the garage was actually where our lab was. Very cliche, like Silicon Valley thing. But so we installed the product in the house, and when you walk in, I think we're all accustomed to like a sensor being on a wall somewhere, and the sensor picks you up, all the lights turn on. Um, well, with our lights, when you would walk into the room, the lights would just turn on and there was no sensor. So nobody had to install anything. A typical consumer could just screw in the light bulb. And then they all mesh network together using some proprietary technology of ours. So they'd all turn on at the same time. And then if there was ambient light, like you see next to me, we also put an ambient light sensor in the bulbs. And so they would dim down automatically and save energy that way. So they wouldn't be expending energy during the day if you didn't need them to. And then you could also use an app on a smartphone to shift the color temperature manually. Or we were using machine learning to figure out people's ideal preferences and shift the color temperature automatically throughout the day. So that was like the core product. And my first contribution to that was we wanted to integrate with the smart home ecosystem. So Nest had a Works with Nest program. Amazon actually launched the Amazon Echo that year. And it was actually, it's hard to remember this at the time, but a lot of people were just laughing at it because they didn't get it. But we were one of the first companies to integrate with Alexa. And I owned that integration. And then we explored integrating with Apple, but it was way too arduous given the resources that we had. And then there was finally a platform. My Echo's yelling at me. There was a platform called If This and That I integrated with. So the first product that I owned was actually the integrations for Stack to make it so that, you know, with the Nest integration, for example, if you have a Nest thermostat, the thermostat might not know that you're home if the thermostat is down a hallway that you don't walk by and the sensor can't pick it up. So if your Stack light saw you, we could actually tell Nest that you're home, and then it could adjust the temperature based on your presence. So having sensors throughout the home. And then I had a really exciting opportunity at Stack because we basically realized the business wasn't working from just like a consumer standpoint, that we needed to pivot into other areas. And so I explored a bunch of different markets where embedded sensors could kind of be repurposed or pivoted for other use cases. So we looked at home security, building security, and actually elderly care. Ended up being where we found product market fit. And so during my time at Stack, I was taking on more and more. And I was basically researching this elder care space and put together a pitch and pitched it to an organization called Aging 2.0, which was kind of the leading conference for technology in the aging space. So that product is basically repurposed our lights so that anybody could install them in an independent living facility or for a loved one who's aging at home. And then a caretaker could look in the app and see if there was any activity in the home that day because we had the motion sensors. So did grandma get up this morning? Did grandma perhaps go into the bathroom and not come back out and have suffered a fall? And then also using machine learning there to see are a person's activity levels trending down over time such that we can make a recommendation for higher levels of care. So that was a really fascinating journey for me because it drew me in because of my love for consumer tech, and then kind of opened my eyes and helped me reconnect with, honestly, like a lot of the values that I felt like Georgetown inspired me in terms of men and women for others and giving back. Being able to pivot the product into elderly care was really amazing. So that's the product that I worked on at Stack, and I can speak to others if you want to.
that you're able to pivot into that market and give back. I just have one last question, and then we'll open up to the students and we'll stop recording. If there's anything, like, what would you have done differently while at Georgetown, knowing what you now know?
Definitely. I mean, you all just mentioned having, it sounds like a program for helping students work in tech in the summer in between school years. And to my knowledge, something like that didn't exist back then. So that's amazing that you're doing that now. And I think um, for me, one of the challenges was I didn't know what was out there. And um, part of me obviously had been drawn to engineering in high school. I took a bunch of AP classes, did AP Calc, actually took BC, AP Physics, and that was enough to get me a leg up when I was doing engineering at Penn State. But even after my first semester, I kind of dropped it because it felt so abstract, and I was having trouble connecting like these really abstract science and math topics with potential real world application. Um, and I think if I could go back, like I should have taken some computer science classes. I did take computer science in high school, but same thing. It was just like, it was so removed from reality for me that I didn't understand why it would be worthwhile. Um, and I also wish so I wish I'd been exposed to computer science. I wish I'd been exposed to what people were doing out in Silicon Valley more. And I think cities have stronger tech ecosystems now than existed back then. Back then, there was a company called Living Social, which was actually started by a former Georgetown graduate, and it was kind of famously like the only tech company in DC. And I remember I did apply to work at Living Social, but again, the economy was really rough back then as well. And maybe this is unfair, but I kind of feel like they laughed me out of the room because they were like, I just didn't have the experience that they were looking for. And it felt unfair because I was like, well, how do I get a job if I don't have experience? And how, it just felt like I was trapped in this vicious cycle at that point in time. So I think one way to break that cycle is to just build something yourself, or to work with your like friends, like fellow students, and just figure out. And it doesn't have to really be like top down, like, oh, I have to build something to get into tech. I think what's more interesting is like, what are actual problems that you experience in your life, that you're drawn to and that you're interested in, and that you want to make an impact around, and then figuring out how you might be able to contribute something. And I think if I was able to um, think about it that way in college, um, and be able to identify peers who had complementary skill sets to mine so that we could collaborate and build something together, um, it would have been a great start. And it's something that I recommend to anyone who's interested in breaking into product specifically is, um, if you haven't been a PM before, just being able to show the ability to exhibit the characteristics that these companies look for in PMs in some way, will help you stand out. And I think there's no better way than actually building something, if you can. So when I joined when I joined at Stack, it was literally like Neil was our founder and CEO, and we might as well not have had job titles. Like my friend Katie, who became one of my best friends there, started out. She was a lawyer full time, um, and she was working up in the city in SF and would commute down at night times and just like help out with the office. And then she jumped ship and came over and worked in HR, and then she became our head of marketing. Um, and so I think we didn't have a formal product organization. And so when you're at a small company like that, uh, it lends itself well to people who are willing to be a little bit proactive and identify problems, and just jump on them and address them, and in a way where you're like just genuinely trying to be helpful. So I would ask Neil, like, what keeps you up at night? Like, is there anything else I can help with? And first and foremost, just getting the stuff that you've already committed to doing done. But so yeah, for him, there was like no need to hire like a chief product officer or anything like that. Cause like when a company is that small, that's really still the founder and CEO's role. Um, and so that's what it was like at Stack. And then just working with Neil over time, like he gave me more and more. And so I became the first PM, and then kind of became like the head of product for Stack Care. That was the elderly care offering. Versus SendGrid, when I got there, it was a 300 person company. We were pre-IPO, meaning we were still funded privately. We hadn't gone public. And interestingly, SendGrid did go public. We were public for a year, and then Twilio bought us. And I think it's much more common for a company that's private to be bought out. So we did both. I can speak to that if that's interesting. But yeah, when I joined SendGrid, there were 300 people, and we had a chief product officer, we had a VP of product, then we had directors of product. And so there were like 4 layers between me and the CEO, including a CPO, a VP of product, and then my manager, who was like a director of product. And that was just kind of one line. And then there's a bunch of other PMs in the org. There were probably like 40 people in the PM org. And so once you get to that size, they, at least at SendGrid, and I think it's very common, is you look at the whole product or product portfolio, if there's multiple products, and you break it down by charter, which is not necessarily like a piece of the product, but maybe a piece of the customer experience. And so for me, I was a platform PM. And so I was actually focused on building out the internal engineering platform that allowed all the other engineers at the company to build things more quickly. And so we built things like, at the time, the company, SendGrid had 3 data centers, and we wanted to transition to the cloud. And we had something called an API, which is an application programming interface that our developer customers used to interact with the product. And so, for example, my team built an API gateway that basically like the API service in AWS. And so we could start moving traffic into AWS as part of that transition. So I was literally just owning this technical piece of infrastructure for this broader product, versus at Stack when it was smaller. Like I owned first the integrations, but then this whole like spin-off elderly care thing. And so, you know, one is just one PM owning part of the product, and then at SendGrid, I was one PM among 40, just owning a sliver of the product, if that helps.